Okay. There. Okay. So we find ourselves in Deuteronomy. Now, this is the fifth and final book of the Law of Moses. Um, what is particularly called the Pentateuch, or the five, is really what that means. But it's the books of the law. And so one of the things that you will notice, and one of the things this brings up kind of at length, is the idea that there is a question that is often asked of, why do we have another book that gives a lot of the same information that was in Leviticus, in Exodus and Leviticus? The reason for that is because this is to a new generation of Jewish people. Because remember that Exodus and Leviticus are right at the beginning of of them leaving Egypt. In fact, Exodus, the end of Exodus, all the way through to the about chapter 9 of Numbers, all takes place while they're sitting at Mount Sinai. Okay, so it is all to the original generation that came out of Egypt. Deuteronomy takes place right at the end of the 40 years of wandering, which means that that generation has all died off. Because remember that except for Joshua and Caleb, none of that generation that was there at Mount Sinai survives to enter the promised land, because they refused to go in. We talked about that kind of at length. So Deuteronomy is written right at the end of Moses' life. This would be within a month or two of them entering the promised land, which also brings up some discussions on the authorship. It is still a common discussion that Moses wrote this, that as God gave him this information, then he wrote it down. Except for clearly the last chapter is not written by Moses, because it tells about how Moses died. So probably didn't write that part. Probably later added by Joshua, just to be completely honest. So that is an important element to this. Like I said, the audience, we are writing to a second generation of Israelites who are actually about to enter the promised land. They were not there when they parted the Red Sea, or at least if they were very, very young. So that's important to understand that the discussion by God after the issue of them refusing to go into the promised land was that everybody who was over the age of 20 at the time of them refusing to go in died. So there might have been there may be a few who were teenagers or children during the Exodus that survived to go into the promised land, but all the people that were adults at that time all died off. Okay. To explain a little bit more about the name, the term Deuteronomy is a Greek word. It means second law, which is very fitting because this is the second giving of the law. Also, this is the book that if you look in the Old Testament, particularly when you look at Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, okay, and the prophets, particularly Isaiah and Jeremiah. When you look at those books, but we'll take specifically the history books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. They are written by someone that, as they are writing the book, are looking at Deuteronomy and how the children of Israel are doing in respect to Deuteronomy. When you look at their actions, when you look at what they're doing, you can see the text of Deuteronomy being discussed. When it talks about the kings that were good and the kings that were wicked, it comes back through Deuteronomy. When you see Josiah, particularly, when it says that he found the book of the law, the reforms he makes clearly say, or fairly clearly say, that what he found was a copy of the book of Deuteronomy, because of the reforms he makes are all things that come out of Deuteronomy. So it is important to understand that while this is a second giving of the law, it is of critical importance to the remainder of the New Testament, or the remainder of the Old Testament, because much of the way it is discussed in the history through the rest of Israel's history come back to what God had told them in Deuteronomy. Okay. The theme of it is a renewal of the covenant. Okay. That is the theme here. God is renewing the covenant with a new generation. That's why this is important. He had made a covenant with the people at Mount Sinai. This is now a new generation that were not of age at the time that he made that covenant. And so now Moses is reissuing the terms of the covenant for this new generation before they enter into the promised land. Here's our covenant. Okay. One thing we'll see as we go into this is at the end of him giving the covenantal stuff, then he goes in and says, okay, if you keep this, here are the really good things that will happen to you. If you don't keep it, here are the things that not so good that are going to happen to you. Very, very clear. Okay. Key verse or key verses. I'm going to say this is this book's version of the key verses. I would tell you there is another that we will get to as we go forward, but Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 46 and 47 are key verses in this. So he said to them, take to heart all the words by which I am warning you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, but your very life. And by this word you shall live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. Okay. Now, this brings up a couple of key words in this. This is not the exact word that is used, but words that are synonymous with this are very important. One of the key words in the book of Deuteronomy is remember. Okay. If you really want to understand what Moses is trying to say, the word remember is of critical importance. Now, it's not always exactly that word. One, take to heart, remember. Okay. Or don't forget. Don't forget comes up a lot. Do not forget. But all of them come kind of into the same idea of keep to your mind, remember, don't forget, keep it on your mind at all times is a key element within the book of Deuteronomy. There are 5 major sections. Chapter 1 through 4 is history. Chapters 1 through 4, Moses goes back and tells them how they got to where they are. So he talks about Mount Sinai. He talks about them refusing to enter into the land. He talks about the 40 years of wandering. He talks about what God did to the kings on the eastern side of the Jordan. He goes through all of those details and brings them to the moment that they are at right then. That's chapter 1 through 4. Then in chapter 5, we begin a review of the law, and this is the longest section. It's chapter 5 all the way to chapter 26. Okay. Chapter 5 begins with a re-giving of the 10 commandments. If you look at verse 5:1, it says, it re-gives the 10 commandments exactly as they are in Exodus. And then we go forward from there. Then chapter 27 through chapter 30 are the curses and the blessings that are attached to them keeping the law. Okay. And then the final section, chapter 31 through 34, is Moses saying farewell. is Moses saying, I'm about to go the way of all men. Joshua's going to take my place, all of those things. Okay. So let's look at a few particular scriptures that I want to make sure we see. Okay. So chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. Okay. Then it goes on to give the place where they were. So it gives some pretty significant details of where they are at and when in the wanderings this takes place. And it says, after he had defeated Sihon and Og, he's beyond the Jordan in the land of Moses. This is the end of the 40 years. This is right before they're about to enter into the promised land. That's what chapter 1, verses 1 through 8 comes in. Then Moses begins, and this is important. At that time I said to you, I'm not able to bear you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars in heaven. And then he brings up how he set them apart into groups. Okay. The appointing of judges, the appointing of small groups of judges up to the big, up to himself. Now we know from Exodus, there's another detail that Moses doesn't get into here, that his father-in-law told him it would be a good idea. He does not mention that it wasn't his idea to begin with. Okay. He just talks about that discussion. So importantly, I set leaders for you. Then in verse 19, we have a retelling of the story of them not entering into the land. The spies and them saying, no, we're not going to go in. We're afraid. We don't think God will protect us. We don't think God will provide for us. Okay. It's important to understand that this is bringing up, once again, why are we where we are? So here's what Moses is getting to. So 40 years ago, the reason we are where we are is because 40 years ago, we were ready to go in and you guys refused to go in because you got scared. Verse 32 kind of gives us the ultimate. Yet in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God. You didn't trust him.
But those are already dead, right?
They are dead. The people that made this decision, the adults at this time, have died. But, so he's coming to another generation that's going, well, why are we in the middle of the wilderness? Well, here's why. Okay. Then in verse 34, he gives the penalty. And so he talks about the fact that, and interestingly enough, we know that this is how it works, but in Exodus and Deuteronomy, it only gives Caleb's name. But we know that Joshua was also, that the two that live are Joshua and Caleb. But in Exodus, or in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, the one that is mentioned by name is only Caleb. Okay. Why did Caleb survive? Well, because he trusted God. He is one of only two spies. The other one, by the way, is Joshua, or at least that seems to be the case. Joshua and Caleb are the two that go, wait, whoa. God will give us this land. We don't need to be afraid of these big guys in these big cities with their huge walls. God will take care of us. And nobody believed them. So he got a reward. They got rewards for that. Caleb, it is very specifically mentioned in Numbers. God says, okay, that land that you went and spied out, it's yours. Personally, for him and his family. Okay. So, then starting in in chapter 2, Moses talks to them about what happened in the wilderness. He goes very briefly, but he brings up a couple things, and this is important. After they had failed to go into the promised land, it tells that they go as far as Mount Seir, and then they go the next place, and God goes, hold on, these are your relatives. These are Esau's descendants. That land doesn't belong to you. You leave them alone. And we'll see that that happens several times. That then later you turn towards Moab and he goes, nope, don't harass Moab. That land's not yours. I gave that to Moab. Okay. So we see that they're wandering and God is going, nope, that land is not yours. So don't go try to take it. Leave them alone. Now we find out later that Moab and these nations actually do end up in conflict with Israel quite often. But as far as their wandering, they were told not to do anything to them. Okay. Then when we come to when we come to verse 26, then we move into the next discussion. So they have been told what land they aren't supposed to take, but now we're near the end of the 40 years or getting closer to that. And they're passing through the land of Sihon, King Sihon. And Moses sends him a message and going, hey, we just want to pass through your land. We'll pay for anything we use. We'll pay for the water. We'll pay for anything. Just let us go through. Nope, not going to let you go through. And they send an attack. Israel wins and takes their land. Okay. Then next we come to Og in Bashan, and the same kind of thing is discussed here. That God then, these are not the descendants of Esau or Lot or any of them. And so God gives them their land. This is the land on the eastern side of the Jordan that is now at this point, as Moses is telling this, is the property of 2.5 of the tribes. Okay, if you'll recall, when we got to the end of Numbers, we have 2 tribes, and then we have part of Manasseh that say, look, we keep sheep, we keep livestock, and this is really good grazing land. Can we just stay over here on the eastern side of the Jordan? And Moses at first gets very angry with them and says, wait, are you trying to get us into the same trouble again? And they go, no. Understand. We want to build houses for our families, and we want to build pens for our livestock. And then all of our men who are of fighting age, we will go in the very front of the army, and we will lead the army to take the land inside the Jordan. We won't go home until you've given the children of Israel rest, until they've taken the land that you've told them to take. So we're not saying we won't go in, but we would really like this probably perfect for what we need. And so this is where they are getting the property. Okay, Sihon and Og. So some of the children of Israel, he's talking about the land they now own. Okay, then at the end of chapter 3, we have the moment where, and he does not bring up all the details here, but the end of chapter 3, Moses points out that he can't go into the land. Okay, he says, God was angry with me, and because of how things worked, and because you didn't listen, and that's how he kind of phrases it. Now, we know part of that is he got upset at them because they wouldn't listen, and he didn't do exactly what God told him, right? God told him to speak to a rock, and he got angry, and he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Although I will tell you that is not the primary reason God was mad, because Moses basically goes, you want water? I'll give you water. Instead of the Lord will give you water, he said, I will give you water. Okay, he got mad. And by the way, if you really look at Moses' life, his big Achilles heel sometimes was his temper. There are a couple times where he does something stupid because he got mad.
Broke the tablets.
Killed an Egyptian. There are several in that discussion. Okay, so chapter 4 is still somewhat history. There's still a lot of history within all of this, but it also comes up to say, make sure you obey the Lord, take care. Okay. By the way, verse 9 of chapter 4 gives us one of these examples. It says, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget. So you don't forget. So remember, I said that remember is a primary thing. Remembrance is a primary theme. Lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children, all of that. Okay. Then in verse 15 of chapter 4, we have this discussion of idolatry being forbidden. Make sure you don't make any graven images. Make sure you don't do any of that. Okay. If you do, God will punish you severely. Is a primary element here. Okay. Also, there's a couple of things that come up at the end of this. God mentions once again the cities of refuge. I'll bring this up really quickly. If you accidentally killed someone, then their family was allowed by Hebrew law to appoint an avenger to come and kill you back. And so you could run to one of these cities of refuge. There were 6 in Israel. There were 3 on the western side of the Jordan. There were 3 on the eastern side of the Jordan. If you ran to one of those cities and you stayed there, then if the avenger came and said, "Hey, I want him because he killed my, he killed my brother or he killed my uncle or whatever," then there had to be a trial before they turned you over. So they would do a trial, and if they decided that it would have been an accident, then you could live there, then you could stay. If they found that you had killed him on purpose, then they would hand you over. But it's an idea of a place to run for justice. Okay, so that's important going forward. Then chapter 5. Chapter 5 begins with a retelling of the 10 Commandments. If you notice that it goes through them once again in chapter 5. Then he talks about remembering them again. He talks about, keeping them. Then chapter 6, and this is why I said more than one primary verse within the scripture, because what I will tell you is, while that passage in chapter 32 may be a central chapter for Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 6, particularly verse 4 and 5, but really you could go as far as verse 9, are the central verses of the entire New Testament, or in the entire Old Testament. Okay, of all of Judaism, these are the kind of the 4 most important verses. Okay, so let's go through this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Okay, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, all your might. Okay, so now let's remember, what does Jesus call that? In the New Testament, Jesus calls this, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul. He adds mind and strength. It's the greatest commandment, right? It's the central commandment of the entire Bible. Okay, he says, what's the greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself is the second one that fits into that. Okay. However, when you look at Hebrew culture, particularly Orthodox Judaism today, you will see this chapter become a central element of Jewish faith. Okay. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So let's go into a little more detail here. You will often find that very Orthodox Jews will have a little box either on their right wrist, or even some will have it right here on certain days. And it's a little box. Okay. This is where they get this. Inside that little box is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your might. Okay. And they put it right before their eyes, on their forehead, or on their hand, where we would wear a watch. Okay. What's the purpose? Well, to constantly be reminded. This one works a little more looking at a movie. For those of you that have ever watched the Charlton Heston Ben-Hur movie, and whenever he comes to his house, and even though it's in ruins, he reaches over and touches the side of his door every time he walks in. That's what this is. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house or on your gates. They would have a little deal on the side of their deal that held a little piece of parchment that had this scripture on it. It is a primary verse for all of Judaism. By the way, it is also one of the reasons why they struggle so much with our discussion of the Trinity. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then they think, well, you worship three. Well, no, we worship one. He's just in three persons. Okay. By the way, I have no idea what faith group it is, but if you're driving between Sanhone and Tucumcari now, there's a billboard that accuses people who believe in the Trinity of being blasphemous. I don't know if you've seen it. If I'm guessing, I'm not sure. I'm guessing some relation to Jehovah's Witness would be my guess. I haven't had a chance to look really closely at the website they give, but
There used to be a house out in the country that had a scripture written on it.
But anyway, as we go in through this a little bit further into chapter 6, notice that in verse 12 of chapter 6, we see this remember discussion again. Take care lest you forget the Lord. Take care that you don't forget. Okay. Now, so from this point all the way to the beginning of chapter 27 is regiving of the law. He goes back through. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail because we've gone through it. And so, he goes back through the law kind of in detail. Certainly not everything, but he talks about some of the important laws. He goes back through some of the feast days. He goes back through some of the stuff that we looked at in Leviticus. There's a lot of regiving here. Okay. From chapter 5 all the way to chapter 27. There are a couple things I want to make sure to mention this. So one of the things that is the reason for this is that God takes these rules very seriously because he's a jealous God. Okay. So this is an important part of Deuteronomy. Hey, don't miss the fact that God takes these rules very seriously. Okay. Now, this is always fun too. Now, notice, and this comes up a lot in the Old Testament, God is described as a jealous God. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. How many of you, when you hear the word jealousy, think of it as a negative? Right? That's how it's portrayed. Okay. So, what is jealousy actually? Now, we think of it as you getting your feelings hurt because someone's doing something you don't think they talking to somebody you don't think they should or whatever. Okay. And that's a level of that. But when we're talking about it as God, what we are talking about is you giving to someone else what belongs to God. God being jealous is a reaction to you giving something that should belong to God to something else, to someone else or something else. Okay. If you are deserving of devotion, and that's kind of the idea here. Okay. Is God deserving of our devotion? Then why would he like it if we gave it to someone else? Right? I mean, that is kind of the discussion of jealousy. Now, the reason it has such a negative connotation in our culture is because in our own hearts that are broken and fallen and all of that, we often take jealousy too far. Okay? But in all fairness, there are times, even in our lives, where jealousy is appropriate. If someone is giving something that should be ours to someone else, then there's some honesty to that. Okay? And that's what God is saying. Look, why are these rules serious? Because you're not supposed to give devotion to anyone else. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm the God who you have covenant with. Your devotion belongs to me. But remember, and this is of primary importance, that God does not sin. Okay? It is a bit like so many other things that we often talk about, okay? Is getting angry a sin?
No. Because the
Okay.
Bible says be angry and sin not.
Okay. So can anger become a sin?
Yes.
Okay.
How far you carry it, huh?
Right. So then here comes the really, really fun question. Can God sin?
No.
So that when God gets angry, it can't be sinful. Now, let's go back to the word we use here, jealousy. So jealousy in and of itself is not a sin, but you can move jealousy to a point where it becomes a sin. But if God can't sin, then God cannot move that to a point that it's a sin. So understand that part of this discussion of him being a jealous God is that he cares enough about us and wants our devotion and cares about us enough that it bothers him when we choose to give what belongs to him to someone else. That's why idolatry bothers him. Right? Let's remind ourselves what are, and some of you have heard me say this and some of you haven't. What two sins, one is a God side sin and one is a human side sin, that in all the Old Testament are almost always treated synonymously. Idolatry and adultery. Okay, so what's adultery?
It's being unfaithful to one you're supposed to be faithful to.
It's being unfaithful to one that you are in a covenant relationship with. Don't miss it. Okay, marriage is a covenant. And you make a covenant relationship to be faithful to a person till death parts you, right? That's what it says. Adultery is to then be unfaithful. When you look at the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, you will find that God will often connect idolatry with adultery. If you were here for while we're in Jeremiah, okay, it comes up a bunch because Israel's sin or Judah's sin is idolatry, going after other gods. But Jeremiah makes no bones about this terminology. He goes and doesn't mince a word. The reason I'm angry is because you're whoring yourself out. And those are the biblical words. You're acting like a prostitute. You're going out and finding every guy you can find. Now, what is he talking about? You're going and chasing after every god. Okay? Hosea. What is the story of Hosea? Hosea is told, go and marry an unfaithful woman. Why? Because Israel's been unfaithful to me. And so I want you to be an object lesson. And by the way, when you look at the story of Hosea, you find this kind of movement where he says, she bears me a son, and I name him Jezreel. Then she bears a daughter. And notice, this is the Hebrew phrasing. It does not say she bore me a daughter. And he names her not my people. And then she bears a son. Once again, she doesn't bear him a son. And he names him No Mercy. Then at some point, and there is some discussion about whether it's the same woman later or not, but I believe it is. She leaves. At some point, she leaves and goes back into a life of prostitution. It's absolutely clear what has gone on. Then God says, now you go get her back. And he goes and buys her back from her prostitution and says, okay, I've bought you now. Now you're going to remain faithful. Those are the exact words that Hosea gets into. And when we get to the very end of Hosea, there's this really interesting discussion that comes up about the one that was once called not my people will now be called my people. And the one who I once showed no mercy, I will now show mercy. So this turning of their unfaithfulness back to faithfulness and God's mercy and grace on them when they do. But when we talk about this term jealous, we have to understand that God sees the practice of having another God the same way a spouse would feel with you being unfaithful to them. And that is a primary discussion in the Bible. It goes all the way into the New Testament, right? What does Ephesians 5 and 6 really do? It says that the marital relationship is a picture of the relationship between Jesus and the church, right? That's really the discussion. We can get into the submit and love and all of that, but really it's you submit as you would submit to the Lord, and he loves like Christ loved the church. And by the way, is way beyond natural on both sides. So it is important to understand. So this is the primary motivation of all of this. As he re-gives the law is here's how you remain faithful. Don't forget, you are in a covenant with me and you are to remain faithful. Don't forget that this is how you show your faithfulness. This is what you need to not do. This is what you need to do to show that you're faithful. Okay? And we go through that and we see so much discussion in several places. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail because there's just a lot. But he talks about when you get into the land and when you find all the blessings I'm going to give you in the land, don't forget me. Right? When everything suddenly goes great and you have a house you didn't build and you have a field you didn't plant and you have, all of this stuff, don't forget me. And start thinking you did all this or some pagan idol did this, or else there'll be consequences. Okay. Then we move to chapter 17 or 27. Sorry. There's a lot more to this. In chapter 17, we get to the discussion of the kings, how they are to live. We talk about tithes. There's a lot of law stuff in here. Okay. But in chapter 27, we move kind of to the next section of all of this. Sorry, I'm trying to get there. It takes a minute for... Okay, so now chapter 27 begins. Now Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep the whole commandment I command you today. And on the day you cross over the Jordan to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster. So you're to make these kind of pillars. And you shall write on them the words of this law. Now, this is an interesting discussion here that I want to make sure you understand. The Bible tells us in earlier in the Old Testament that when you built an altar to God, you weren't to use any plaster or anything like that. Unshaped stones just in a pile. You didn't cut the rocks, you didn't use mortar, you didn't use anything. So these are not an altar. What they are is a large pillar that has engraved into the plaster you've put on them the words of the law. It's a reminder of what God had told them. See? So when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones concerning which I command you, one on Mount Ebal and the other one on Mount Gerizim. Now, if you know your geography in here, what you'll find out is Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are two large hills. They're not mountains. Okay. They're large hills, and they're separated by a valley. So they are two mountains. They're close together. They're separated by a valley. And what it says is you're to put a copy of the law on Mount Ebal, and you're to put another one on Mount Gerizim. Okay, those are the two that you are to do this. And then you are to, on a regular basis, and I think it's once a year, as I recall. But you go to Mount Gerizim and look at verse 12. I'll do this. When you've crossed over the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay. And these shall stand on Mount Ebal: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. So half the tribes stand on Mount Gerizim and half the tribes stand on Mount Ebal. And across this valley, they basically yell at each other. This is how this works. The people who are on Mount Gerizim will yell the blessings that come from following the Lord. Okay? If you follow the Lord, these really good things will happen to you. And then the guys on Mount Ebal yell back, but if you don't obey the Lord, here's the really bad things that'll happen to you. Now, here is the fun part of this that we kind of have to deal with. Mount Gerizim is this beautiful green mountain. Mount Ebal is a rock. So there's actually or at least the understanding is there's an actual visual representation in the very character of these two mountains to explain, if you obey me, if you don't.
And how does that apply to us today?
Well, specifically to us today, it's not the same following the law, but the truth of the matter is that if we choose to obey and follow God, follow Christ, then there will be blessings that come to us. Now, I want to be fair, does not mean we will never have hardship. Okay? But sometimes hardship is a blessing. Let's not lie. Okay? If we choose to rebel against God, then there are consequences. That's really the whole discussion of this area. If you will be faithful to me, here is what I will do for you, because you are being obedient. Even when it's not easy, you're being obedient. There will be blessings that come. Okay? Now, we have to be careful, because we have groups even within Christianity today that say, well, if you just, have enough faith and all of that, then God will do all these incredible things and you'll never have any hardship. Nothing will ever go wrong in your life. You'll never get sick. You'll never, all of that. That is certainly not a biblical concept. Okay. But there is clearly an Old Testament idea that said, hey, Israel, if you will be obedient, then you will be amazed at the ways I bless you. In fact, in some places in the Old Testament, God goes, "Hey, if you'll be completely obedient, you'll never have a miscarriage. Your crops won't fail. You'll get rain when you're supposed to. All of that. I'll bless you. If you don't, then you'll find out how bad it can get." Okay. So we do have to be a little careful because there is some discussion there.
But we're not cursed.
We're not
Is
cursed.
there such thing now as generational curses?
So let me answer it this way, because this is a difficult one. Okay. I would have to tell you yes. Okay. And why do I say that? Because how many times do we see things that a parent does or ways that a parent lives gets passed down to their children? Now, I want to be very careful because I want to make sure I'm biblical in the way I say this. There was a movement within Jewish culture to say, well, the reason we're struggling is because of our parents. We're not really guilty. They are. And the Bible says, no, 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 no. No. You're guilty of your own sin. Okay. You are not being held accountable for your parents' sin. You're being held accountable for your own sin. However, I would have to tell you, just watching, just through what we see, yes, there are places where the actions of a father or the actions of a mother are passed down and lead to sins in the lives of their kids.
Even if they change, the mother or the father repent and don't do that anymore?
Yes.
Yes. And can you pray that out of somebody, off of somebody?
So here's what I will tell you. Okay. Let me just use straight out of scripture. God makes a very real statement that says that he can redeem the years that the locusts have eaten. Okay. So what do? There are people that have spent large parts of their lives with the locusts eating them. The locusts eating their relationship with their children, with their relationship with others. Are there consequences for that? Yes. Can God redeem that? Yes. Okay. Generational, the idea of a generational curse or generational sin might be a better way to say that. And I'll give you an example. Okay. If you have had an issue with, let me be fair. Let me just be personal. I'm being a little bit vulnerable for a minute. There has been time in my life where I've had a serious issue with pornography. Now, let me be fair. If you go in and look at statistics, they say 50 to 75% of ministers have an issue. It is not uncommon. Okay. All three of my kids have had to deal with it. Now, is that all on me? No. But there is still a part that because I was unable to hold off on that particular thing, I made it easier for my kids to be involved in it. Does that make sense? Look, I'm not telling you that there, the Bible says that there are things that pass down. Okay. However, on the wonderful side of that is this. In Exodus and in Deuteronomy, it talks about this idea. It says that curses come to the third and fourth generation, but it says righteousness goes to the 1,000th generation.
Ooh, I like that.
Okay, so understand, this is not an easy thing to talk about, because you go, well, does that mean I'm not responsible, or does that mean I am responsible for my kids? Some. But they're still responsible for their own actions. Right? And by the way, the other thing I will tell you is that God can break any generational curse. But I'll be fair. There are some that are not even necessarily the discussion of the Bible this sounds really weird, but poverty is a generational curse. If you have a parent that lived there, if you lived your childhood in poverty, your chances of living in poverty are incredibly higher. Why? Because you don't learn how to, right? It passes down from generation. And by the way, Michelle would tell you that there is almost the idea of there is a spirit of poverty. That there is an attitude that comes with living that way that tends to breed itself, as weird as that sounds. But guess what? If God steps into someone's life in the midst of that, he can shatter that. And that's true across the board. But the Bible does very clearly say, you are not responsible for your kid's sin, and your kids are not responsible for your sin. There's a place earlier where it talks about, there's some generational aspects to it, but later they go, oh, well, no, it was our dads that did this, and so we're not responsible. And God goes, no. You're responsible for your own sin. I hope that answers the question a little bit. It's difficult to explain the idea because it's just difficult to take that what I did affects me, but that's really what it is. I don't know if it's curse so much as it's just the fact that how you live affects your children, right? If you are let's use a different example. Okay. This one's a little bit scary. Statistics will tell you that the best way to keep your daughter from having a promiscuous lifestyle when she's a teenager and in college is for dad to be loving and affectionate and to give her to show her worth. That when she shows her that she's valuable, when he shows her that she's worthy to be treated correctly, when he shows her what love is, then she's less likely to get into all the garbage. Well, in a way, that's part of that discussion of a generational sin. If you neglect your kids, there are things that come from it. Now, I want to be careful to say, like I said, that is not always the case. Okay, you can be a great parent and have kids that jump off the deep end. Right?
Right.
Or you can be a really bad parent and have kids that decide they just don't want to be like you. So, but we can't look at the Bible and really look at real life and not go that there aren't some things that get passed down.
I thought, how you read different translations or
Mhm.
versions. And this has been years ago. I thought I had read somewhere about at a point God did away with all generational curses.
So
I have not been able to find.
So it's not. So let's. There is a place where it says, "I'm no longer going to say that I hold you accountable for what your parents did."
Okay.
So that
Maybe
your
that's
sin,
not-
that your parents are culpable for your sin, or your sons are culpable for. Okay. However, let's be fair of the term. We often use the idea of curse as a demonic thing or being held accountable. Really, when we talk about that term, what we're talking about is a sin that seems to pass down.
And is that the same as Deuteronomy's curse? Same.
So in this one, it is no.
Is it demonic?
Here, no, it's talking about there will be punishment from God.
Okay.
This curse is punished. So cursed be anyone who dishonors his father and mother. It's God will punish. That's the term here, at least here. that this curse discussion is God will punish you if you do this. God will punish you if you do this.
I'd be so cursed if I did Deuteronomy.
I agree.
What did you say? I'd be so cursed if I lived back then in my life.
But some of these are pretty rough, you know. I mean it. But what we're dealing with, and remember that the kind of the key function of all of this that we kind of have to understand is God going, hear me when I say this, I'm not joking. I'm serious. When I told you that this is how you need to live to please me, there are ramifications of you choosing not to do that. Okay, so here it really is kind of the discussion of a contract. It's covenant, right? So if you go in and go buy a new car, right, and you sign a contract, in that contract it says, if you don't pay, here are the lists of things we can do. Okay, if you choose not to pay on this car payment, then first of all, we'll up your interest rate. Then if you don't pay again, then we'll send you nasty letters. And if you don't pay for a while, we'll come take the car back. Right? And they have to put that in there. That's what this is, really. Is if you choose not to obey, here are the wonderful prizes you can expect.
God knew at that time that nobody.
Oh, yes.
Nobody
You're
could be
absolutely
perfect
right.
like that.
And
That's why Christ came to save us.
absolutely. Remember that, and by the way, this is how the New Testament brings it up. The Old Testament, the law of Moses, is a school teacher to teach you that you can't meet the standard. Okay? However, it is also important to understand that God says, if you don't make the standard, there are consequences for you not doing it. Now, you're right. Nobody could. But remember also that, and this is a critical element of the law of Moses. If you failed to keep the law, there was an answer. You come, make a sacrifice. This animal dies in your place.
And then they wouldn't be
Well-
cursed
well,
if they did that?
so-
the sacrifices
so-
reverse that, or
Well, it depended on their heart.
so like us repenting
So-
and
so-
turning from it.
Look at David, for example. Okay. We don't get his sacrifice stuff, but think about what David did. Okay, he goes out, he finds this woman who's another man's wife, he has an affair with her, she gets pregnant, then he basically arranges her husband's murder to try to get away with it, right?
Mhm.
Okay. God says, you did this, so there's punishment. Right? Did the punishment go away? No, the kid died. What David did is goes, oh my gosh, I really did absolutely blow it. God, I am so sorry. I hate what I did. Right? Psalm 51. I hate what I did. I'm appalled at what I did. And I don't want to make this mistake again. And so I want to turn from this mistake and I want to restore my relationship with you. There's still punishment, but God restored the relationship with David. Now, for the rest of David's life, you see the punishment that came from his actions.
Mhm.
However, his relationship with God was restored. So there's a discussion here. The discussion of the curses, in a lot of it, is a discussion of the one who does this and is not repentant. Okay, now that does not mean when you disobey God, there are consequences of some kind. It's just, there are times where God is merciful and you don't see the consequences.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's worse because you're expecting to get beat over the head and he doesn't do anything. You know, it's the same as dad going, oh, I'm really disappointed. And for some people, that's not effective at all. And for some people, man, that's the worst thing that could happen is for dad to go, yeah, I'm disappointed. But understand that, yes, no one could meet the standard, but he provided a way to restore the relationship, which is the ultimate curse in all of this. There are curses that say, I will remove my blessing from you because you did this, and there will be consequences. But the ultimate curse is you lose your relationship with me. Up to including the point where, if we're going back to Jeremiah, where we are in Sundays, where God goes, yeah, I'm booting you. In fact, don't miss the fact that when God talks about the northern kingdom in Jeremiah, he goes, yeah, I gave her a divorce decree. I ended the relationship. And then he goes, but for you, I'm not going to divorce you, but yeah, it's going to be bad. So understand that part of this is the reason for the sacrificial system is, look, if you really want to restore the relationship, you can. Doesn't mean God will remove all the consequences, but you can restore the relationship. But don't miss the fact that throughout the Old Testament, he says, there are a couple places where it says, oh yeah, you're coming and giving your sacrifices and I despise them because you're just coming to do it.
It's a checklist.
And you don't really hate what you've done. You're just coming to check mark. The same thing is true in the New Testament with Jesus. Now, I'm Southern Baptist. I believe that once you have truly come to know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you can't lose it. That's a foundational thing for me. Okay, if you have truly come to know Jesus as your Lord and your Savior, and have chosen to live for Him, okay, and have been saved, then it's settled.
That means you can sin any sin and still.
Well, but here's the thing: does God know every sin you're going to do? So when you sin after you've become a believer, did God go, oh my gosh, I can't believe he did that?
No.
Okay. But here's the other side of that. Paul goes, you can't accept Jesus and then just go on the way you did. See, I will tell you that there are people who say, oh yeah, I walked the aisle and I prayed a prayer and I did all those things. And when they stand before Jesus, he's going, I don't know you. And I hate to be fair that way, but some of that, I know we're chasing a rabbit, but some of that is our fault because we've cheapened the gospel to say this prayer.
And we just don't condone sin in other people, but I don't say anything either. You know what I mean? To even say, that's really not what you should be doing. And I'm sure myself.
And I think there are times for that and there are times not for that. There are times you do need to say, hold on, now I don't know that this is right. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to be condemning because we don't fit with the one who has no sin cast the first. We don't fit there. We're not that one.
Well, the people who are the same are not going to show them the way to Christ.
Right.
And if we ostracize them by the way we treat them,
right,
then what do they have left?
And remember, this comes back to John 3. Their sin's not the real problem. Their sin is a symptom of the problem. The real problem is they don't have the Spirit. They have not met Jesus. They are, and by the way, this is exactly how Jesus puts it. They are spiritually dead. That's the way the Bible teaches it. The real issue that keeps you from Jesus, the real issue that sends you to hell when you die is that you've lived a life where you were spiritually dead. But coming to spiritual life involves a surrender of all that you are, all your deadness and all of that, and God giving you new life through the Spirit. right? Born again. When you look at John chapter 3, Jesus never uses the word sin once, never even discusses it. The closest he comes is he goes, well, the reason that they don't like me is because the reason that people don't like the light is because the light reveals their darkness. And that's as close to sin as he ever gets. What he tells Nicodemus is, you got to be born again. You got to be born of the Spirit. He does the same thing to the woman at the well. Now, he does confront her sin at one point, but really, his main thing is, well, you need living water. You need to take the water I can give you. Now, he does at one point go get your husband. She goes, well, I'm not married. That's right. You've been married 5 times, and now you're living with a guy you're not married to. But he doesn't go, and that's your problem. What does he do? Thank you for being honest. Have you ever looked really closely at how he approaches that? He goes, well, why don't you go get your husband? Well, I don't have a husband. And he basically goes, I'm really proud of you for telling the truth, because you've had 5 husbands and the guy you're living with isn't your husband now. I'm really proud of you for telling the truth. He doesn't call her any names. He doesn't tell her how terrible of a person she is. He doesn't do any of that. He just goes, yeah, you're right. Oh, by the way, I know. And what is her response when she goes into the village? He told me everything I ever did. But that she runs back out to him. So what does that mean? Really, what she is saying is, he knew everything I ever did, and he still loved me.
He was probably the only one who ever said, I'm proud of you.
I mean, it's such a powerful thing. We can, if we choose to abandon our faith and understand, like I said, I'm Southern Baptist. I believe you can't lose your salvation. But David says in Psalm 51, restore to me the joy of my salvation. Mm-hmm. You can lose any of the benefits apart from heaven. Mm-hmm. And we often tend to think that, oh, I get saved, so I have fire insurance. You know, heaven is the thing. Heaven is the least of the rewards of becoming a follower of Jesus. The biggest reward of being a follower of Jesus is his daily presence in your life. Your eternity starts at the moment you get saved. But there are a lot of people who, jump on the fire insurance wagon, and they're going to find out they weren't there.
And how can they ever overcome any sin without that power?
Right. Well, Jesus even tells a parable about it. He goes, hey, the first one, it's the road. And he says, they never had a shot. The seed landed there, so they had a shot, but the ground was so hard and so packed down that the birds came and ate it before it had never had a chance. And then it goes to the next one and says, well, they had this huge emotional response. That's kind of a clear thing there. They received it with joy. They emotionally received it. And it's great. And the first time it gets bad, right? How many people do we create that way when we tell them, oh yeah, Christianity is an easy thing? No, it's not. It'd be kind of like somebody saying, well, I'm going into the Marines. Oh, that's easy. So rewarding. There is one that we do that to people, though, when they get pregnant. You're just going to be so happy when you have a baby. It's just going to be the best thing ever, always. No.
And then the terrible twos are the worst of it.
Uh-huh.
They're
all right.
adults.
So just to close out, I know we're a little past time, but just to close out. So he goes through the blessings and the curses. He talks about what will happen if they obey and if they don't obey. And then at the very end, he talks to them about Joshua and all those things to get them ready for crossing over. And then the very last chapter, it talks about the fact that God takes him up onto a mountain overlooking the promised land. And he shows him the land he's going to give the people. And it says, and specifically it says that Moses died there and God buried him. God himself buried him. Okay. And then at the very end, it talks about there has never been another guy like Moses. At that point, he says he talked to God face to face like they were friends, all of that. Now, the reason I bring up that last little bit is that when we come into the New Testament to Matthew, you see Jesus as a new Moses. He has the same kind of relationship with the Father that Moses did. Okay. All through these 5 books, it talks about that a prophet gets a vision, gets a dream, gets all of that. Moses talked to God like a friend. Moses had an incredible relationship with God. Did he still mess up? Yeah, but he had an incredible relationship with God. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up in Joshua next week. I'm sorry to keep you guys long.
No, it's
It's all right,
that
we're
was
getting
my
too dark.
fault.
It's still light outside.
It was interesting.